Okay, so let's continue. So in the previous video, we were talking about the definition of GDP, which we said that um, I will use the notation Y to represent GDP. And based on the definition, we would expect that this would be in dollar terms because it's the market value um, of the final products, not used products, not intermediate products, and has to be produced within the border of or the borders of a certain country within a specific period of time. Okay, so anytime you're defining gross domestic product, you have to be sure that all these different important terms are included. In this video, I'm going to talk about the 4 different components of GDP. So let's start with the first one, which is the consumption, and number A, which is C. And C here, as I said, it's our notation for personal consumption expenditure. Okay, and it's basically the spending of households on goods and services. Okay, and just make sure that whenever I say goods and services, make sure that we are not including buying houses, because if you buy a house, we consider this as related to our next type of spending, which is investment spending. Okay, so this one does not include houses. Okay, so houses are not there. Our second component, which is the investment, and this is I is our notation, and we define this I as the gross private domestic investment. And we actually have like 3 important categories of this investment. So we have the first type, which we call it the business fixed investment, and this represents the spending by firms on new factories, let's say office buildings, machinery, and these machinery used to produce the goods. Okay, so you can come up with different types of spending as long as it's made by the businesses and it's a fixed investment. So you can say like new factory or factories. You can say like office building. You can say computers, desks, right? Chairs, whatever. Machinery. Okay, and these machinery are used to produce goods. Okay. Our second type of gross private domestic investment is residential. So when you buy a house, we said that it's not considered as a part of consumption. It's not there, but it's here. So whenever you spend, like spending, whether the spending is by households, right, or and or firms on like anything new, right? Make sure it's new, something produced within the year. Let's say single family house or multi-unit house, right? So multi-unit houses, all these are considered as residential investment, and make sure it's not something that is produced 10 years ago or last year even. It's this year. It has to be within a specific period of time, usually 1 year. Anything before that, it's just not included in our computation of this year's production. The other type, which is very important, which is called the change in business inventory. Let me also, I just would like to erase HH because I used to write it as two capital H's. So I just want to make sure that I'm not confusing you. So households, two capital H's. So a change in business inventories, right? So now you're producing something and you're trying to sell in the market, right? If it is not sold in the market, you're going to keep it in the storage room, right? So you can think of it as inventories. So whenever anything that is produced but not yet sold. So because some people would get confused about the meaning of inventories, right? So where inventories are goods produced, so you have already produced them this year, right? But you haven't sold them already, so not yet sold. Okay, and finally our last component, which is the government spending. So it's not actually our last, we still have net exports. So number C, which is G, which we call it the abbreviation for the government purchases, right? So this is basically the spending by the government, and you can divide the government as federal, you can have it as state government and local government. Okay, so these are different types of components of governments. So they're spending on goods and services. So let's say they pay for teachers' salaries, they pay for highways, they pay for hospitals, and so on. So these are included in the G, or the government spending. So next, which is our net exports. So net exports is the last component, which is our fourth component. Net exports, and X is our notation for net exports, which is exports minus imports. So make sure to understand that anything that is produced in the country is included in GDP. The imports are not produced in the country, so that's why they have to be excluded, and that's why we have a negative sign in here. Exports are produced in the economy. So exports are the goods and services produced in the economy. Let's say the US. Okay, so we are in the US. So let's say in the US, and produced so it is produced here, but it is consumed by someone else. So it's purchased by foreign firms or foreign households or governments. Okay, and the imports has to be subtracted because they are the goods and services produced, right, in foreign countries. So we should not include them because this is not our production. So in foreign countries, and so let me just try to make some space here. So the goods and services produced in foreign countries, but they are purchased by US firms, households, and governments. Okay, so just make sure that these have to be excluded because they are not produced in the US. So this is how the GDP is computed, right? So just to make sure that, let me wrap up what I was saying. We were saying that GDP is equal to consumption plus, or personal consumption expenditure, plus gross domestic investment with its three different types, plus the government purchases with the three different types of governments, federal, state, and local, plus net exports, which is the exports minus the imports because the imports are not produced in the US. And because I wrote everything in notation, so let me also write the GDP in notation so that we are not confused later on when I use Y. So I'm using Y to represent GDP, or my notation for GDP. And also I said that these different four categories are the categories made or divided by the Bureau of Economic Analysis from the Ministry of Commerce. So they do divide it, or they do divide the GDP into these four different components, and that's how they measure GDP. This way of measuring GDP is called the Aggregate Expenditure approach. Okay, so from now on I'm going to say AE approach, the Aggregate Expenditure approach. Okay, an alternative way is called the value added approach. So both of these approaches are actually used, right, to measure GDP. So you can either use A or B, and both A and B are used to measure GDP. Okay, and the number B is an alternative approach. So let's now talk about the value-added approach. So I'm not going to focus on the value-added approach. I'm just going to give you an idea about the value-added approach. So instead of adding together all expenditures on final goods and services, this is used as an alternative way of computing GDP, and it's actually a way of just adding as the name suggests, the value or the additional value made at each stage of production. Okay, so you can define let me write here, so this is our number B, the value added approach. The value added approach is the market value a firm adds to a product. Okay, so let's say when I talk about the price of a shirt at a specific store, okay, so the price of a shirt I'm going to look at the different stages of producing the shirt, and I'm going to add each value to come up with the price. So in other words, it is equal, the price of a shirt that you see in the store is simply equal to the sum of all value added that are added throughout the different stages of production. Okay, so let's say you think about it this way. What is the value of the first stage of production, which is raw cotton? Okay, and now the raw cotton was equal to $1. Okay, so the value added here, the price is just $1. Next, what is the value of raw cotton when you have it in the second stage? So it's woven into fabric. So this is the second stage of production. Suppose that the price of the shirt now becomes 3. So this stage I have only added 2. So this is the value added at stage number 2. Next, what is the value of cotton fabric made into shirt? So you go like this is stage 1, this is stage 2, this is stage 3. So the value of the cotton fabric, so you're going to the third stage, so cotton fabric, right? And it's made into shirts. And suppose the value now is 15. Okay, how much I've added at this stage? 15, right? Minus the previous stage, so 15 minus 3, I have added 12. Okay, and then next, what is the value of the shirt? Right, so the value of this shirt, let's say it's 35. How much I've added here? So I've added 20. So when you add all these up, you come up with 35, which is the value of the shirt that you see it in the store. So you just keep on adding the value added at each stage of production until you come up with the value of the product. And you do that for each and every product in the economy. Of course, as you might expect, it's like very complicated approach in order to come up with a value of each specific item. But it's just an alternative way of computing GDP using the AE approach. The next point I want to talk about is what are the most important shortcomings in GDP as a measure of total production. So, as I said, our measure of how the economy is performing, our measure of production that we commonly used is gross domestic product. So, what are the disadvantages? What are the shortcomings of using GDP as a measure of production? The number one thing is there are many activities that I cannot record, right? So if I'm using or if I'm producing a certain product for my own self-use, right? So you are a carpenter, you're making a bookcase for your personal use. This is not included in GDP, right? If you are a hairstylist and you're styling your hair, this is a service that is not included in GDP, right? If you are a teacher and you're teaching to your son, this is a service that is not included in GDP. So there are multiple examples, right? So related to household production. And this production, I can produce a good, as the example I just gave you, or a service, right? So it's household production, so goods and services that people produce for themselves. So all these are not included in our computation. I give you an example of a carpenter. making bookcases, so making bookcase for personal use, or I gave you an example of hairstylist, right? You're styling, yes, hair for cousin, for example. You're not taking money, okay, and you're not included in GDP. I gave you a teacher teaching for the neighbor, for example, not taking money, or you're teaching for your son, you're not taking any money in return. It's not computed in GDP, okay. There are also, or there is also another important shortcoming, which is called the underground economy. So the underground economy is the idea of buying and selling of goods and services that is concealed from the government, and whether it could be concealed from the government either to avoid taxes or to avoid regulations, or because the goods and services are illegal, let's say drugs, okay. So the underground economy is important, right? And again, so you're buying and selling of goods and services. So this activity concealed from the government. So the government does not know about it, right? It's not included in any statistics. And this is to avoid, people want to avoid taxes, they want to avoid regulations, they want to avoid being kind of detected because it's illegal. And you can have multiple examples that you can think of, right? And I said just drugs, but I'm sure that you can come up with other examples that are done without being reported, right? And this is are under the umbrella of underground economy. So in the US, for example, the underground economy consists of about 10% of GDP, and it's almost around this number from one year to the next. So it's not like of a huge problem. Like when you say it's 10% of GDP, it's not that of a huge problem. But in some countries in Africa, the underground economy that can go up to 50% of GDP. So I want you to imagine that half of the gross domestic production is not reported because it's either illegal or it's related to any activity that is done in a way that is hidden so that people want to avoid paying taxes. Okay. I'm going to end this video by talking about two types of gross domestic production. So the gross domestic production can be the real GDP and the nominal GDP. And I want you to understand that, or remember that in my definition of GDP, I said it's a value, right? It's a value, so it's in dollars. So if you want to get a value of my production, it makes sense that I want to get how much I produced, so it's quantity, and what is the price per unit, so you multiply this times price, or you can think of it as P times Q. So P times Q for each unit I have, or for each good I have, or for each service I have, I'm going to take the quantity produced and times the price, and this would give me the value. So the differentiation between real and nominal GDP is based on these two components, right? So if I'm talking about nominal GDP, the nominal GDP, let's start with the nominal. Nominal GDP is the value of final, so it's always final, right? We said that. Final goods and services evaluated at current year prices. So if I have, let's say, two goods, right? So I'm gonna say, okay, the nominal GDP is equal to price of good 1 times the quantity of good 1 plus price of good 2 times the price of good 2. I have to be in a specific year, right? So it's within a certain period of time, the computation of GDP. So let's say this is in 1990. So I have to make sure that I'm talking about the prices of the 1990, the prices of the 1990, and of course this is the quantity of 1990 and this is the quantity of 1990, right? So it's simple, right? P times Q for each goods and services produced, and I'm just assuming the economy has, like this big assumption, the economy has only two goods. So the computation of nominal GDP is the value of final goods and services evaluated at current year. So 1990, the current year prices are used. Now, suppose I'm talking about the real GDP. The real GDP is defined. Let me just take this a bit up. So the real GDP So what is a real GDP? So the real GDP is the value. So I'm just repeating again. So the value, it has to be final goods and services evaluated at a base year. So what is a base year prices? So it's a constant year. So I'm fixing a certain year. I'm saying that, okay, I'm focusing on production. I really don't care about the movement in prices. So I'm going to fix a certain year prices and consider it as my base year. So again, I have two goods, right? I have two goods. And suppose my intention is to compute my real GDP of the two goods, and again it's the price of the good number 1 times the quantity number 1 plus price of good number 2 times the quantity of good number 2. Now suppose that this is done in the year 1990, so I'm really focusing on the production of 1990, but I have to determine a base year, or what is the year that I'm fixing the prices at. So suppose the base year is 85 or 1985, and this is just an example. So suppose the 1985 is the base year. So the prices here are going to be the prices of the base year, the prices of the base year. So the idea here, if I'm really focusing on production, I'm using the real GDP, and that's why whenever we talk about economic growth, which is the actual production in a certain country, we focus on real GDP because I want to filter out the effect of movement of prices. This one is a kind of mix because 1990 there might be changes in prices, there might be also changes in production, but I really don't know the value of GDP here is because of the increase in prices or increase in production. But here, if the prices are fixed over the last 5 years, I'm fixing a certain year for all the years starting from 85 to 1990, the changes in real GDP are only related to the changes in production because prices are held constant. So whenever you see me having this bar over a certain variable, this means that this variable is held constant. Okay, again, this one is the focus of economic growth. If you are concerned about how the economy is performing in terms of its production, then you would actually focus on real GDP. This one has a mixed effect of prices and quantity at the same time. In the next video, I will show you an example or a numerical example on how to compute real GDP, nominal GDP, and we will also talk about another terminology which is called the GDP deflator, which is the measurement of the change in prices. Okay, everyone, so I'm gonna stop here and I'll talk to you in the next